as you may know, I've been very critical of the memo that was written that appeared to be at least the excuse for firing James Comey. But I would like to know that the person who is now in the Department of Justice in charge of the investigation from that end, that he actually has some credible basis for making the recommendation to fire the then director of the FBI.
And we know from the president himself to Lester Holt that the reason given by Rod Rosenstein in that memo was not the reason that James Comey was fired. The president told Lester that he had wanted to, from the beginning, fire Comey. And the fact that that memo quotes from Eric Holder and other people, not contemporaneously and out of context, isn't that questionable?
Of course it was. And Andrea, you know, listen, as the former Attorney General of California and a career prosecutor, if I was given a memo that was that vacuous in terms of, you know, citations about law and protocols and regulations that had no first-hand information, it appeared to be double hearsay at best, I would send it back and say, come back again if you've got a stronger case. But that can't be the basis for firing the director of the FBI who was actively engaged in an investigation about, let's be clear, the interference by Russia in the election of the President of the United States.
Do you understand why the president keeps praising Mike Flynn? Why, according to one report today, Flynn told a group of friends at a dinner recently that he got, in essence, an attaboy, you know, hang tough, from the president in the middle of this investigation?
Based on everything that I've heard and read, the administration knew about the fact that there was an active investigation into Flynn. The idea that they would have known this at the time that they brought him in to have such an important role in the administration, a role that is someone who is privy to top secret information about national security, is unfathomable. The fact that they did not vet him, that they knew that he had an active investigation and they didn't reject him, is completely unbelievable and deeply troubling, because it also has to do with whether this administration fully understands the responsibility of trust that is vested in them. The people of the state of the United States have vested in the President of the United States the public trust, and he must earn that, and right now he's not.
Now, you're a former career prosecutor and attorney general. There's been a lot of criticism of the Senate Intelligence Committee staff for being a good Intelligence Committee staff, but not having former prosecutors who are really have the experience to go after what they need to go after here. What do you think of that?
As a member of the Senate Intelligence Committee, I believe that the staff is doing a good job. I believe the committee is doing a good job. I have been frustrated, though, Andrea, that the pace of the investigation, I believe that we need to get to the truth at a quicker pace. And at any point that I believe that we're failing to do the job we've been charged with doing, of investigating Russia's interference in the election of the President of the United States, I'll walk away. I have been calling, as you know, for months now, that we would also have a special counsel, a special prosecutor appointed to oversee the criminal investigation, and I'm glad that that's finally been done.
Is there a concern, or should Robert Mueller have a concern, frankly, that these committees, that your committee and others, might get in his way? We know what happened in a different era under a different special prosecutor law when Oliver North ended up having his conviction overturned because of the conflict between congressional investigations and special prosecutors.
So there is a process that takes place in most investigations at a local level, a statewide level, and certainly also at a federal level, which is, we call it deconfliction, where various agencies or bodies that are investigating an issue will find an opportunity and make an opportunity to check in with each other to make sure that we are not stepping over each other's toes, so to speak. And I am sure that that will happen with Bob Mueller in charge of the investigation. I know Bob Mueller, based on his years of being in the Bay Area, back when I was a prosecutor in Alameda County in San Francisco, and I think he is fully equipped to make all of the right decisions to ensure that there is not a conflict between these various investigations.
You've been calling for Jeff Sessions to resign. Do you now believe that Rod Rosenstein should also resign?
I have questions about Rod Rosenstein's ability to be in any way in charge of this, and in particular because of the memo. You know, that was his first official act when he took on this important position of being #2 at the United States Department of Justice, and he affixed his initials and apparently even authored a memo that clearly was written for the purposes of press and not for the purposes of the integrity and professionalism of the United States Department of Justice. I also am concerned that he was aware that Jeff Sessions was involved in the firing of Comey, and we are all aware that Jeff Sessions is supposed to be recused from any matter that relates to the Russia investigation, and we know that Comey was fired because of the Russia investigation. So there is a complicated web taking place, and Rosenstein is a part of that, and that concerns me in terms of his ability to be unbiased and to actually pursue his responsibilities.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.